All right. To everyone drawn to the eerie, the unsettling, and the downright unexplainable, you're in the right place. If you live for stories that send chills racing down your spine and linger in your thoughts long after the lights go out, then get comfortable because this one hits different. Before we dive in, I've got to ask, where are you tuning in from and what time is it on your end? The stories. This park bench became the key to 5 disappearances. In many archived reports tied to a quiet suburban trail, one park bench kept showing up in every witness statement. The bench sat beside an older walking path that locals used for years, and it became the center of a strange pattern tied to 5 missing people. The story followed a 34-year-old technician named Braden Lyle, who lived a few miles from the park. He worked maintenance shifts at a small distribution center, and he often stopped by the trail after long nights on the floor. He used the spot to unwind and clear his head before heading home. His goal that morning in early autumn of 2021 was simple. He planned to sit for a few minutes and send a short message to his sister who had been asking about a ride the following weekend. Braden parked near the first turnoff, and he walked toward the bench while thinking about breakfast. The path was empty that morning, and the air felt colder than it usually did. He reached the bench, and he set his bag down while noticing fresh flowers near the base. He had seen flowers there before, but usually only 1 or 2. That morning, he counted 3 bunches, and each looked recently placed. He sat and opened his phone, and that was when he heard a faint snap behind him. He turned, but saw no one on the path. He listened for a moment, and he heard what sounded like quiet breathing near the small cluster of trees. He stood and called out a simple greeting, and he waited without moving. The breathing faded, and he felt uneasy enough to step back from the bench. A woman approached from the trail side and asked if he had heard something by the trees. Her name was Maren Ulrich, a 31-year-old caseworker who visited the trail on her days off. She pointed toward the bench and said she had seen a man sitting there 2 days earlier who vanished after dropping a small notebook. Braden asked what she meant by vanished. She explained that the man had walked toward the trees, and no one saw him leave the area based on her follow-up checks. Braden felt a chill and picked up his bag, and he asked if she had looked around for the notebook. She nodded and said she had found it under the bench. She kept it at home after failing to find a name inside. She told him she could bring it later if he wanted to see it, and he agreed since the story bothered him. She said she would return in an hour after finishing her walk. Braden stayed near the bench and looked around the clearing while replaying her account. The flowers suddenly felt more significant, and he remembered a local post from late 2020 that mentioned a missing runner who often paused near that same bench. He opened an archived article on his phone and saw a blurred photo of the bench with a date stamp. His stomach tightened when he noticed the same pattern of flowers near the legs. He walked closer to the tree line and saw a strip of cloth caught on a branch. He reached up and pulled it free, and he noticed faint mud streaks along the fabric. He placed it on the bench and took a photo for his own record. He had done informal volunteer searches before, and he knew documenting small clues mattered when nothing else made sense. A man in his late 50s entered the clearing and stopped near the bench. He introduced himself as Arvin Drexler, a retired surveyor who lived across the road from the trail. He asked if Braden was looking into the disappearances tied to the area. Braden said he was only trying to understand what happened near the bench. Arvin nodded and said he had seen similar details across several years, and each case started with someone stopping to rest. Arvin pointed to a narrow gap in the trees where old markers hung from metal hooks. He said the markers were part of an abandoned drainage project from the early 2010s. He explained that the project left several deep maintenance pits that were never fully filled, and he believed people may have fallen into an access point hidden under thick brush. Braden asked if he ever reported that theory. Arvin said he tried, but no one followed up due to limited staff and unclear evidence. Maren returned with the notebook in her hand, and she gave it to Braden. The cover felt worn, and several pages had faint impressions of older notes. He flipped through and found a short line written on the last page. It said, "Met them again by the bench after nightfall." The handwriting looked shaky, and the ink appeared fresh compared to the other pages. Braden asked where exactly she found it. She said it had been wedged between 2 boards under the far side of the bench. Arvin leaned closer and said he had never seen anyone place a notebook there, which made him think the writer returned recently. Braden felt the temperature shift and noticed a faint draft coming from the gap in the trees. He walked toward the marked area and pushed aside thick branches. Beneath the fallen brush, he found a concrete lip with rusted bolts. The ground dipped sharply, and a hollow space opened several feet below. He knelt and used his phone light to check for movement. He saw only old tools and a broken ladder. Yet something about the depth made his pulse race. He called out to ask if anyone was down there. No one answered, but a weak echo carried the sound back. Marin suggested checking the other side of the pit for a safer angle. They circled the clearing, and Arvin pointed to a collapsed section of fencing that partially covered another opening. Braden cleared some branches, and he spotted a shoe near the edge. The rubber looked worn, and the sole pattern matched a detail from the runner case he had read earlier. He carefully reached for it, and he noticed dry mud around the heel. Braden asked Arvin to hold his phone while he photographed the shoe. Marin stepped back to avoid disturbing the area, and she scanned the surrounding branches for more fabric. She pointed to another strip caught on a higher limb, which matched the cloth Braden found earlier. They connected the pieces and realized someone had likely moved through the gap with enough force to tear clothing. Braden called a non-emergency line and reported the discovery. He gave general details without naming the notebook and said he believed an old maintenance pit posed danger to visitors. A dispatcher said someone would check the site later, though no estimate was given. That answer frustrated Braden, and he decided to take additional photos to support the claim. As he prepared to leave, he noticed the flowers again and realized each bunch marked dates close to older missing person reports. He photographed the flowers and compared their spacing to the article images. The match felt close enough to suggest someone used the bench as a memorial or a signal. Marin suggested the writer of the notebook might have met someone connected to those flowers, and the line about meeting them again could imply repeated encounters. Braden opened the notebook once more and touched the last page. He noticed tiny indent marks above the line that hinted at a torn message. He angled the page toward the light and saw faint shapes. It looked like someone had written a location reference before removing the sheet. He took a close photo, planning to use editing tools later to enhance the impressions. They decided to walk the perimeter of the clearing before leaving, and Arvin guided them to an older fire road behind the benches. The road had cracked pavement and faded tape lines. He said he once saw a person wearing a reflective vest walking that area at night during 2018. He never identified the person, but he remembered the pattern on the vest matched old county uniforms that were discontinued years earlier. Braden connected that detail to the notebook entry and wondered if the writer had followed someone who claimed to inspect the trail. Marin said the county stopped sending inspectors to that area due to limited funding, which made the sighting even stranger. Arvin agreed and said the person may have used an old uniform to avoid suspicion. They returned to the bench, and Braden looked at the wooden boards where the notebook had been found. He noticed scrape marks near the underside. He slid a hand under the frame and found a small metal clip. It felt loose, and he pulled gently. A folded paper slipped out and landed on the ground. He unfolded it and read a short handwritten note that said, "Follow the lights near the cutoff after dark." The writing matched the notebook. Marin covered her mouth and said the message made her think someone used small lights to guide visitors toward the maintenance pit. Arvin said he once saw flickering lights near the cutoff during late 2019, but assumed they were kids playing with flashlights. Braden realized the lights may have lured curious people toward the gap. They stood silently as the idea settled. The disappearances could have been accidents caused by a hidden pit and a misleading light source. The writer of the notebook may have followed the lights and nearly fell or witnessed someone else fall. Braden suggested the writer tore out the earlier page to give it to someone, possibly a friend or an officer, yet the person never turned it in. A faint gust moved through the clearing, and Braden felt uneasy again. He gathered the notebook and folded note, and he said he would deliver them to the local station as soon as possible. Marin said she would provide her statement about seeing the notebook drop 2 days earlier. Arvin agreed to guide officers to the pit if needed. They walked back toward the parking area while discussing safer trail access. Braden looked over his shoulder at the bench, and he felt a strange pull. The bench had been a quiet place for years, yet its role in 5 disappearances seemed tied to simple mistakes, hidden hazards, and poorly understood signals left by an unknown person. The truth felt less like a supernatural mystery and more like a chain of overlooked warnings. Braden left the park with a steady resolve to push for a full inspection. He believed the answers were already there in the bench, in the flowers, and in the fragments of notes hidden under old boards. The truth only needed patient eyes to connect what had been ignored, and he hoped the next visitor would find the trail safer once those connections reached the right people. The nurse who refused to enter room 6 again. Lila Farnes first heard about Room 6 through a short entry in an old staffing report that mentioned unusual overnight disruptions. The report was dated to 2009 and came from a small regional clinic that sat outside a quiet town with limited medical resources. Lila was 33 and worked as a traveling nurse who filled short contracts in understaffed facilities. She arrived at the clinic during early autumn when the halls felt calm and the night shift moved slowly through predictable routines. Her simple goal that week was to keep a steady rhythm while saving money for a move planned for the next spring. On her second night, she was assigned a rotation that included Room 6, which held a recovering patient named Dorian Pike. He was 62 with a mild respiratory issue that required observation but posed no immediate danger. His chart suggested stable progress, which meant the room should have been an easy stop during her quiet rounds. The incident began when Lila stepped inside the room and noticed a faint tapping sound that seemed to come from the wall near the bed. The patient had been awake, and he watched her with an uneasy expression that suggested he wanted to speak, but hesitated. She asked if he needed anything, and he answered with a flat, "Please keep the lights on tonight," which struck her as odd, given his preference for darkness noted earlier by the day nurse. During her next pass, the tapping returned and felt sharper, like something struck the wall with steady intent. Lila checked the hallway and found nothing unusual beyond a supply cart resting near a closed door. She reviewed maintenance notes later and saw that workers had previously inspected the wall after a similar complaint in 2006, yet found no loose utilities or structural issues. The complication deepened when a nurse on the shift before hers mentioned archived calls made by former night staff. Those calls reportedly described patient distress related to sudden cold drafts that moved through Room 6 even when vents were shut. Lila filed this in her mind, but kept her focus on what she could directly verify, which meant returning to the room with a calm approach and simple checks. When she entered again, she saw Dorian clutching the call button with both hands and staring at the same wall that had produced the tapping. He whispered, "They move through here," which confused her because he had no history of disorientation and his oxygen levels looked normal. She tried reassuring him, but he pointed toward a small framed print that hung crooked like someone had pushed it earlier. Lila documented the scene, then stepped into the hallway to compare notes with the evening charge nurse named Brenton Shaw. He was in his late 40s and had worked the clinic for many years, which gave him perspective on long-standing issues. Brenton admitted that Room 6 had frequent incident logs related to unexplained noise, but he never saw anything dangerous, so he kept assignments unchanged. The investigation began after Dorian reported that someone had touched his arm during a period when no staff had entered the room. Lila checked the security panel near the nurse's station, which showed timestamps for door openings captured by the badge sensor. The logs indicated her previous visit, followed by a long gap with no recorded entry, which made his claim puzzling. She then reviewed older patient notes from 2003 to 2008, which described brief episodes of agitation from individuals with no history of anxiety. Several mentioned hearing movement behind the wall near the bed, and one wrote that a picture frame had tilted during a quiet stretch. These details were small but consistent, which encouraged her to look for a physical explanation. Lila asked the maintenance lead named Corbin Rusk to inspect the wall after her shift ended. He brought a handheld thermal scanner and ran it across the surface while she watched from the doorway. The tool showed a thin vertical band of cooler temperature that did not match the building layout, which suggested an unregistered cavity or narrow chase behind the drywall. Corbin returned during daylight with a small borescope camera designed to look behind tight spaces. He located a hidden seam in the corner that had been painted over during earlier renovations. When he guided the camera inside, they saw a slender gap between structural supports where unsecured pipes ran without proper insulation, which explained both the cold drafts and the intermittent tapping. The twist emerged when Corbin followed the pipes farther and discovered that the cavity connected to an abandoned service chase sealed decades earlier, according to archived renovation notes. That chase once linked several rooms, including Room 6, where older patients had repeatedly complained about footsteps at night. The noise likely traveled along the hollow space and grew sharper as the building shifted during temperature changes. Lila returned to Dorian with the findings, which eased his fear because it gave something concrete to replace earlier uncertainty. She watched him relax when she explained how air moved through the gap and how small vibrations struck the wall during normal settling. He nodded and said, "That makes more sense than what I thought," which helped restore predictable routines for the rest of his stay. The payoff became clear a few days later when the clinic sealed the gap with proper insulation, which stopped the tapping that had bothered so many night staff over the years. Lila felt relieved because the solution fit every clue she had gathered from logs, witness comments, and earlier maintenance records. She no longer feared the room and worked her shifts without hesitation. Still, she remembered the moment she first stepped into room 6 and sensed tension that felt older than her short assignment. She knew many stories deepen when fearful people misread unfamiliar sounds, but she also understood how convincing those moments can feel. Later, she often said that small mysteries usually shrink under steady checking and clear evidence, which matched her experience at the clinic. Lila finished her contract without further issues and moved to her next job carrying a quiet confidence shaped by those nights. She still thought about Dorian and the relief in his voice after learning the real cause behind the unsettling moments. Room 6 stayed sealed and silent after the repairs, which meant future patients would sleep without wondering what moved behind the wall. The stories. The final log from a lighthouse on a foggy coast. A faded coastal report from 2008 mentions an unsigned log found inside a shuttered lighthouse during routine maintenance. Workers said it looked recent, even though the building had been locked for years. The discovery triggered a quiet review that centered on one man named Corin Halbrook, who once served as the tower caretaker. Corin was 39 and worked as a part-time dockhand in a nearby fishing town, and he checked the old structure whenever storms rolled through. He liked the quiet building, and he felt responsible for keeping it safe because his late father had worked there decades earlier. On a cold morning in early autumn, he headed out with a simple goal, which was to finish a roof inspection before the fog returned. He hiked the narrow path with his tool pack, and he noticed the fog drifting in faster than expected. A supply boat sounded its horn, and the echo pulled his attention to shifting shapes that moved across the water. He reached the lighthouse door and found fresh scrape marks on the metal surface, and that detail threw off his routine. Inside, he heard a soft clatter from the watchroom above, and he paused because no one should have been there. He climbed the steep stairs, and the air felt heavier with each step because the tower trapped the fog that seeped through old seams. When he reached the top landing, he noticed a lantern lit on the small desk, and he knew he had not left it there earlier that week. He read the open logbook and saw an entry written in a neat hand that did not match his script. The note described a boat drifting without lights near the shoals, and the timestamp matched the previous night. Corin wondered who had written it, and he checked the radio shelf and found a handheld set powered on with low battery. He stepped outside to scan the water, and the fog swallowed most of the horizon except for a dim shape moving slowly near the rocks. He raised his binoculars and saw what looked like an old skiff listing toward a channel notorious for hidden ledges. He called a warning through the radio, and he waited for a response that never came. When he hurried back inside, he noticed another fresh line in the logbook, and it read that the skiff had no operator visible on deck. The handwriting appeared slightly rushed, and Corin felt a jolt because the ink looked wet. He checked the stairs and heard faint steps descending even though no one passed him on the landing. He followed the sound to the service room, and he found a damp jacket draped over a chair that had been dry earlier that week. The pockets held a small notebook with water stains, and the pages carried brief notes about frequent, low fog and strange lights near the channel. The most recent note mentioned a voice over the water calling for help, and Corin closed the book because the air suddenly felt colder. He decided to document the building for safety, and he used his small camera to take photos of the fresh marks on the door and the lit lantern. He moved room to room, and he captured the damp jacket along with the notebook because he wanted evidence for the harbor office. When he checked the time, he noticed the fog outside turning a darker shade, and that sign suggested another weather shift. He stepped out on the gallery to examine the water, and he heard a low groan coming from the direction of the shoals. He could not see the skiff anymore, and the silence that followed pressed against his nerves. He returned to the watchroom and prepared to close the logbook, and that was when he noticed a final half-written entry near the bottom of the page. The unfinished line described a man on the gallery waving toward the tower, and Corin froze because he realized he had just been on that same walkway. He checked the door and found it closed tight, and he felt sure no one had entered while he moved through the rooms. He read the last words again, and the implication unsettled him more than any storm he had faced. Corin prepared to leave, and he secured the logbook under his arm because he planned to hand it over to the harbor office. As he reached the ground floor, he heard a deep thud from above, like something heavy striking the metal railing. He looked up the stairwell and saw dust drifting through the pale air, and he called out in a steady voice asking if anyone needed help. No reply came, and he hurried outside because the building felt wrong. The fog had thickened into a wall that blocked the path back to town, and he saw a faint glow near the rocks, as though the skiff lights flickered through the mist. He considered walking toward the beach, and he radioed the harbor office with a brief report of strange activity near the tower. Dispatch logs indicate that Corin's transmission cut off mid-sentence, and the signal ended with a burst of static. A search team followed the path an hour later, and they found his tool pack near the lighthouse door, but not his radio or the logbook. Witness statements described drifting voices on the water that night, and one crew member claimed he saw a dim lantern moving inside the tower. The unsigned log, discovered months later, matched the fragments found in Corin's notes, and investigators believed the entries were written over several days. They concluded that the skiff likely struck a submerged ledge, and they suspected Corin attempted to reach survivors through the dense fog. No further entries appeared after the final line mentioning the figure on the gallery. The lighthouse remains closed today, and the tower stands quiet during most storms. Local crews say the watchroom light sometimes flickers during heavy fog, and they assume it is faulty wiring from years of neglect. The final log stays in a small archive, where the pages still show faint stains from salt air and old sea fog, and the case sits unsolved with quiet respect for the missing caretaker. The stories. This lakeside pier hides something no one reports. Lodge crews in the region still talk about an old pier tucked behind a quiet lake that draws almost no visitors. They say the pier looks normal from a distance, yet people keep finding strange evidence near its end that never reaches public reports. In the summer of 2019, a maintenance worker named Ryland Keating drove out to that lake for a simple task. He was 29 and worked routine grounds jobs for a small county crew. That day, he only needed to replace a warped board along the outer section of the pier. He liked the lake because it stayed calm even during busy seasons, and he figured the job would be quick enough to finish before lunch. When he parked near the tree line, he noticed the lot was empty, which felt odd because anglers usually arrived before dawn. The air felt thick, and the water looked darker than usual, yet he kept moving because the repair order had been waiting all week. He set his toolbox near the first post, then started walking along the pier to check for softboards before carrying supplies to the far section. Halfway across, he heard a short knock against the underside of the pier, which he assumed came from drifting debris. He leaned over the edge to look for logs, but saw nothing moving. The sound happened again, just 2 boards ahead, and this time he felt a faint vibration under his boots. He stepped back and tried to decide if the pier was shifting because of wind, but the lake's surface stayed flat without any waves. He reached the final stretch where the railing changed from new planks to older, weathered pieces. A notebook sat against the inner corner near the last post, which made him freeze because the crew did not store items out there. The notebook looked soaked along the edges, and several pages had stuck together. He picked it up and flipped through the front until he found a name that he did not recognize. The entry mentioned fishing conditions from early spring and included a rough drawing of the lake that ended with a short line stating the water felt wrong that day. He set the notebook down and crouched to check the damaged board that needed replacing. When he pulled the old plank free, he spotted a small metal badge wedged between the beams. It had no markings other than deep scratch lines that looked deliberate. The badge felt cold and heavy despite the warm morning air. He wiped away dirt, then placed it inside his shirt pocket because he wanted to check county records later. Ryland returned to his truck for the replacement board and felt uneasy during the walk back because the knocking sound continued at irregular intervals. When he reached the trunk, he noticed mud streaks on his rear bumper that did not match his earlier tracks. The streaks started near the center, then curved down toward the gravel, as if someone had leaned against the vehicle. He looked around the empty lot and called out asking if anyone needed help. No answer came back. He carried the new plank to the end of the pier and installed it quickly because he wanted to leave. While tightening the final screw, he heard a voice from the tree line near the far side of the lake. The words were hard to understand, yet the tone sounded urgent. He turned and scanned the shoreline, but saw no movement except for a faint ripple near the reeds. He stood still and waited for another sound, then heard what he thought was the same voice repeating a short phrase. The wind picked up, which carried the sound across the water in a strange pattern that made it difficult to pinpoint the source. He packed his tools and walked back toward the lot. Before reaching the shore, he noticed footprints near the first post that looked fresh. They were smaller than his boots and pressed deeply into the wood, which suggested someone had been standing there minutes earlier. He followed the prints for a short distance until they looped back toward the reeds and stopped abruptly where the boards felt damp. When Ryland returned to the office, he turned in the repair report and mentioned the found notebook and badge. His supervisor asked him to set both items on a side shelf until someone from records could examine them. That afternoon, the supervisor checked archival calls for that area and found references to an unconfirmed missing angler from early spring. The angler had signed in at the visitor kiosk but never signed out. Crews searched the lake for 2 days, then scaled back when no solid evidence surfaced. Later that week, Ryland decided to look deeper into the notebook. He flipped through more pages and discovered entries describing odd pressure changes near the pier on quiet days. One entry detailed a single ripple moving against the wind and stopping precisely under the pier. Another entry described faint tapping at night that sounded mechanical. None of the entries suggested danger, but the tone shifted in the final pages as the writer mentioned seeing a person standing near the reeds who vanished before he could wave. Ryland checked weather logs for the period mentioned in the notebook and noted a rare drop in barometric pressure that occurred without a storm. He also examined an old photo stored in his phone from a visit months earlier. In the photo, the lake looked normal, yet a small shape near the reeds reflected more light than surrounding water. He zoomed in and noticed a faint outline that resembled a shoulder above the surface. He thought it might be a lighting artifact, but decided to keep the image for reference. A week later, he returned to the lake with a coworker named Laramie Downs, who handled safety inspections. Laramie was older with years of field experience and usually dismissed odd reports, yet she agreed to help because she remembered the missing angler case. They arrived early and walked the length of the pier while checking for structural issues. Laramie tapped each beam with a small tool to test for hollow spots. When she reached the section where Ryland had found the badge, she paused because the sound changed. The beam gave a dull response, like something heavy sat under the structure. Ryland lay flat on the boards and lowered his arm to feel beneath the edge. His fingers touched a cold object that felt like metal. He reached further and pulled out a thin plate with holes drilled along one side. It looked like part of an old sonar bracket, but the lake had no recorded installations. Laramie suggested checking old maintenance logs from 2005 because the county once considered adding depth sensors for safety. She also noted the plate looked corroded only on one half, which indicated it had been partially shielded from water for a long time. They carried the plate to the truck and decided to walk the shoreline before leaving. Near the reeds, they found a small indentation in the mud that resembled a knee print next to a flattened patch of grass. The mark faced the lake as if someone had been kneeling to look at something. Laramie pointed out faint parallel lines near the water, which looked like drag marks. She photographed the area, then flagged it for a follow-up survey. Back at the office, Ryland compared the bracket plate with old schematics from a short-lived depth monitoring trial. He found a drawing showing 2 test brackets installed near the pier before the project was canceled. The logs stated the devices were removed after several malfunctions, but the final report accounted for only 1 bracket. The missing bracket had apparently fallen into the lake or been removed without documentation. The scratch lines on the badge matched the spacing of the holes on the plate, which suggested they had been stored or moved together at some point. Ryland checked weather sensors near the lake for unusual readings over the past year. Several early morning reports showed sharp changes in water temperature near the pier despite stable air conditions. He also found a dispatch log from late spring describing a caller who reported seeing a person waving near the reeds before disappearing under the surface. Responders searched but found no footprints and concluded the caller may have seen a bird landing. One night, Ryland returned to the lake alone because he wanted to verify something noted in the notebook. He walked to the end of the pier and stood still, listening for tapping. The lake stayed quiet until a single knock sounded beneath the beams exactly where he had felt vibration weeks earlier. He crouched and waited, then heard a softer knock that echoed against the metal bracket he had removed. He realized the sound pattern resembled the rhythm of small waves hitting a barrier, which made little sense in calm water. He shined a flashlight into the gap where the bracket had been and saw a narrow space that opened into a small cavity under the pier. Something metallic glinted near the back wall. He reached with a long rod and pulled out a rusted hinge attached to a bent bar. The pieces looked like remnants of an improvised tool. He placed the hinge on the deck, then noticed a wet footprint forming near the end post. The shape appeared in seconds, as if someone had stepped there recently. The board around it stayed dry while the footprint darkened. Ryland backed away slowly and pointed the light at the tree line. Nothing moved, and the air stayed silent. He waited for the footprint to fade, but it held shape for several minutes before drying unevenly. He documented the scene with his phone, then left the lake without waiting for more signs. Weeks later, the county closed the pier for extended maintenance and sealed the logs from public access. The missing angler case remained unresolved, yet several notes were added stating unexplained structural anomalies had been found near the outer section. Ryland kept copies of the notebook entries and the photo of the bright shoulder shape. He never returned to the lake, but told coworkers the pier held a mix of forgotten equipment and quiet warnings that did not reach official channels. He believed the clues pointed to someone spending secret time under the structure long before the angler disappeared. He also believed the knocking he heard came from shifting metal against trapped beams rather than anything mystical. Still, the unexplained footprint remained the detail he never understood. Today, the lake sits quiet behind dense trees, and the pier shows new boards that look identical to the old ones. Locals say nothing strange happens there anymore, and officials agree. Ryland thinks the place carries its own quiet trail of missed signs, and he hopes they stay buried where they cause no more stories. The stories. What a hunter's dashcam, caught before it went dark. Ranger files reportedly include a brief dashcam clip from a small county trail where a hunter vanished during a quiet winter morning. The footage circulated among local deputies for years, and some said it captured the last clear moment before everything went dark. Calder Rusk was a 39-year-old warehouse supervisor who hunted whitetail on weekends near an old service road outside a rural township. He liked the quiet routine because it reminded him of calm trips he took with his uncle during the late 1990s. On a cold morning in early 2017, he set out before sunrise with a simple goal to test a new trail camera he had mounted near a frozen creek. He drove a faded pickup with a budget dashcam that ran whenever the engine turned, and he kept it for insurance reasons. He headed toward the tree line under a pale sky and planned to reach his blind before other hunters scattered the deer. He parked near a thin cluster of spruce trees and noted the strange sound of distant engines that did not match the usual logging trucks. He stepped out, locked the truck, then grabbed a small pack that held water and a thermal layer. While crossing the first ridge, he heard a sharp crack from the lower creek bed that stopped him long enough to check for falling branches. He saw nothing moving through the frost and continued toward his blind with the plan to return by mid-afternoon. The trigger came when he noticed a line of prints that curved away from the creek with a stride that seemed too wide for any deer. He crouched and studied the marks, which looked oddly pressed, as if a heavy object had settled briefly before sliding forward. Witness statements from 2 hikers later confirmed a loud metallic scrape in that area around dawn. Calder followed the prints along a narrow stretch where the snow had thinned near a power cut. He took out his phone and snapped 3 photos, which appeared in the recovered data after his disappearance. In the first photo, his gloved hand pointed at a deep trough in the ice. In the second photo, a faint reflection hinted at a dull shape beneath the surface. In the third photo, the trail bent toward a thicket with sharp broken branches. Complications piled up when he reached the old blind and found the canvas flap torn along the side where he kept a small heater. He checked his gear, muttered that kids might have messed with it, then noticed the same strange prints circling the blind at least twice. A nearby birch trunk had a fresh gouge that lined with a rough metal edge rather than any animal claw. He reportedly radioed a friend named Orrin Dale around mid-morning and mentioned a set of tracks that looked artificial. Orrin later told deputies that Calder sounded tired but focused, which matched the timestamp on the dashcam file. The truck sat untouched all morning except for a brief moment when the wind pushed snow across the lens. Calder decided to hike toward the ridge above the old service road since the prints kept drifting uphill. While climbing, he spotted a rusted trail marker that had not been maintained since 2005, and he stopped long enough to compare the lower section with the strange gouge on his blind. The cuts matched in width and depth, which led him to believe someone had been dragging old equipment through the property. He continued over the ridge and entered a narrow pass where discarded fencing lay half buried under ice. He bent to check a twisted strand and noticed faint smudges that looked like dried hydraulic fluid. The smell was faint but distinct, which suggested a leaking machine had passed through at some point during the previous night. He recorded a short voice note on his phone saying he planned to follow the trail until noon. Deputies later found that note in the recovered cloud folder, which helped build a basic timeline. According to weather logs, the wind picked up around midday and the ridge became unstable. Forest crews said a section of the old pass sometimes shifted during heavy gusts, which caused minor slides that could trap a person in loose snow. Yet something in the final dashcam clip suggested a different angle. By early afternoon, Calder returned to his truck, but he looked unsettled. The dashcam captured him walking from the tree line with quick, heavy steps while glancing over his shoulder. He opened the door, tossed his pack onto the passenger seat, then leaned inside while breathing hard. A faint metallic clatter echoed from the ridge, which made him freeze for 5 full seconds. He whispered, "That was not a deer," then climbed in and started the engine. The camera angle showed his eyes tracking something moving between the trees. Snow drifted across the hood while a light creak came from behind the truck. The sound repeated twice with a rising pitch that made him tense his shoulders before shifting into reverse. He backed a few feet, paused, then pulled forward, as if unsure which direction offered safety. His hands shook on the wheel and he muttered, "Come on," while trying to scan the tree line. The camera struggled to focus because frost built on the windshield, yet a brief silhouette appeared to the right. The shape seemed tall, with a narrow top that tapered toward the ground. Officials never confirmed that detail, though. Several deputies mentioned the silhouette in informal notes preserved in the archived case file. The shape moved once, then vanished when the camera auto-adjusted. Calder shifted again and chose the narrow path back toward the main road. His breathing slowed, but he kept glancing at the rear mirror as if tracking invisible movement. 20 seconds before the file ended, the truck lurched violently to the left, which knocked the camera sideways. A burst of static filled the audio and a heavy thud landed somewhere near the rear bumper. Calder shouted, "Hey, stop!" Then the camera caught a slanted view of the ridge, where a dark form slid under the branches. Snow showered the hood as he pressed the accelerator in panic. The final clear frame showed a long scrape running across the truck bed, which matched the gouge found on his blind. Investigators believed something metallic struck the truck during that moment, although no working equipment was ever logged on that road. The clip ended when the camera lost power due to a damaged cable that had been cleanly severed. Calder Rusk was reported missing the next morning when he failed to show for a shift at the warehouse. Search teams found his truck stuck in a shallow drift about a mile from the service road. Tracks around the vehicle were distorted by wind, though one responder noted a long impression shaped like a flattened cylinder that matched the strange prints seen near the creek. Despite a wide search, no clear evidence explained what he chased or what followed him down the ridge that day. Rangers later concluded that unstable terrain and poor visibility likely contributed to his disappearance. They preserved the dashcam clip because the strange sounds and the silhouette raised questions they could not fully answer. Years later, locals still talk about the footage that flickered for a few seconds before going dark. Some point to old reports of scrap equipment dumped along the ridge, while others mention odd engine noises heard during cold mornings. Whatever happened that day seemed tied to the silent shape moving through the trees as Calder rushed back to his truck. The story now serves as a quiet warning for anyone who hikes beyond that old service road. People say the trail feels different after heavy snow, and the ridges shift without warning. The clip remains the only known record of what a single hunter found before everything faded into static and winter silence. The stories. The fisherman who kept hearing his name over the radio. Evan Carr spent most mornings on the narrow inlet where the water carried old radio chatter from nearby boats. Local crews reported that odd transmissions sometimes drifted through that stretch, and many believed they came from abandoned gear left after storms. He treated those stories like tired dock rumors until one calm morning changed his thinking. Evan was 38 and worked as a small-scale fisherman who supplied a few markets inland. He kept his aluminum skiff tied near the inlet because the currents stayed gentle and the tides rarely pushed hard. He headed out around sunrise on a day in early summer 2019 with a simple goal to check crab pots he set the night before. He liked the quiet and usually ignored the static coming from his battered radio. He started the motor, then steered toward his first buoy, while soft wind pushed light ripples across the inlet. He reached for his thermos when the radio cracked with a burst sharper than usual, which made him pause. Static hissed for several seconds, then a faint voice said his name with a slow, careful tone. It sounded like a person trying to speak through heavy interference. Evan thought it came from a nearby boat because signals often bounced across the water in unpredictable ways. He looked around but saw empty shoreline and one distant trawler that was already moving toward deeper water. The voice repeated his name with the same drawn-out sound, and he felt a sudden cold weight that did not match the warm morning. He tried to answer, but the radio only returned a faint hum that flicked in and out like something powered by a weak battery. He shut the radio off to reset it, then turned it back on, hoping the strange signal would vanish. Instead, he heard a low, rhythmic tapping that reminded him of someone hitting a metal hull in slow, measured beats. Evan finished checking the first pot, but his focus kept drifting to the radio because the voice carried a dull echo that felt unnatural. He tied the pot and planned to finish the rest quickly so he could return to shore where he hoped to test the antenna. The moment he reached for the throttle, the radio shifted again and whispered his name in a tone that sounded closer than before. He headed towards shore while replaying that voice in his mind because it carried an uneasy familiarity he could not place. Dock workers later said he arrived faster than usual and looked tense as he pulled his gear onto the planks. He asked if any boat had called for him that morning, but no one reported a transmission with his name. Evan returned home and wrote down the time of each strange broadcast because he wanted to check older notes he kept on similar events. He found 2 entries from early spring that mentioned brief whispers through the radio shortly after heavy fog settled over the inlet. He ignored them at the time because the fog distorted signals and created odd echoes that bounced between cliffs. He spent the afternoon checking online forums that tracked regional marine frequencies where enthusiasts archived recordings from previous seasons. One contributor posted a thread about ghost transmissions that came from a derelict trawler that sank in the late 2010s after a major storm. According to the thread, the trawler carried a short-range radio that sometimes flickered on during low tide when exposed wiring reacted to saltwater. Witness statements from local patrol crews reported faint voices calling crew names during those periods, though no identity was ever confirmed. Evan noted that detail because the thread mentioned distorted speech patterns that matched his morning experience. He called a friend named Cal Rowan, who worked part-time with a small rescue group, and asked if the inlet held any wrecks near his route. Cal said an old survey map showed one submerged boat that rested near the deeper bend south of the inlet. He offered to meet Evan at the dock so they could check tidal charts and mark the likely location. They met near sunset and compared notes while a light breeze pushed the smell of seaweed across the planks. Cal studied Evan's written times, then said the pattern lined up with a recent series of reports about intermittent transmissions during rising tide. He suggested they record any new signal the next morning using a portable device with stronger range than Evan's aging radio. Evan agreed, even though the idea made him uneasy because the voice felt personal in a way he could not explain. Morning arrived with heavy gray sky as they motored toward the bend marked on the survey map. Evan turned on the recorder while Cal monitored the radio and watched the water shift with the incoming tide. They waited for several minutes before a burst of static cracked through the speaker with a sharp rise that made both men flinch. The voice spoke again and said Evan's name with a tone that now carried a clipped urgency. Cal looked at the recorder, then stared toward the bend because the voice sounded as if it came from somewhere below the surface. Evan gripped the wheel and tried to steady his breathing because something in the tone reminded him of an old coworker who vanished years earlier during a late-season crossing. He mentioned that coworker to Cal, who asked if the man ever sailed near this inlet. Evan said that the coworker named Reed had worked on a small crew that fished along the same coastline in early 2017. Reed later transferred to another vessel that sank during a storm that occurred north of their town. Local reports said the wreck was never fully recovered because shifting sand made the search difficult. Cal suggested they check archived dispatch logs from that storm because crews sometimes reported drifting debris that could help them understand how anything connected to Reed might reach this inlet. They returned to shore and visited a small office where a retired dispatcher kept scanned records from older calls. The dispatcher recognized Evan and allowed them to search a digital folder that stored logs from early 2017. One log described a partial sighting of a damaged trawler hull drifting south several days after the storm. The report said the hull carried broken antennas and fragments of a radio panel that still flickered when exposed to sunlight. A second log mentioned a patrol officer hearing a distant voice through static that repeated a crew name before fading. Evan realized the name in that report matched Reed's last name, but the log did not mention if the voice said anything else. He remembered that Reed had a habit of calling coworkers by last name during early morning shifts when he tried to stay awake. The connection felt loose but too strong to ignore because the timing aligned with the drifting hull. Cal said they should return to the inlet during low tide, because exposed wreckage might reveal old wiring that caused recent broadcasts. Evan agreed, though, his stomach tightened because the voice spoke with increasing clarity each time. They secured the skiff, then returned that afternoon when the tide receded and revealed dark shapes below the bend. They anchored near a shallow patch where twisted metal poked through sand like remnants from the storm. Evan moved closer and saw part of a radio panel caught between two rusted beams with wires trailing into the water. Cal used a long hook to lift a loose section and found a corroded tag that matched the radio model used on Reed's crew during 2017. The radio crackled at that moment, then delivered another faint call of Evan's name, with a tone that now carried slow rising static. Cal recorded the sound while Evan watched the wires shift with the gentle pull of the tide. He understood then that the wrecked panels sometimes connected when saltwater reached the exposed terminals, which created a short burst of power. The burst likely triggered fragments of an old emergency recording that captured voices during the storm. Evan remembered that some crews recorded internal chatter before impact, and those recordings sometimes contained rushed calls that repeated crew names. The voice in his radio may have been part of that final chatter, which echoed through damaged wiring each time conditions aligned. They brought the recording to the dispatcher, who played it through a clearer speaker. The voice echoed sharply, then faded as the static rose, which made the source obvious. It was a broken emergency loop that repeated fragments from a doomed crew's final minutes. The distorted tone made the calls sound directed, but they were simply names, shouted during chaos. Evan felt a heavy release of tension because the mystery carried a painful answer, but at least it was grounded in something real. He asked the dispatcher to contact local authorities so they could mark the wreck and prevent more confusion. Cal agreed and said the inlet should be flagged on new charts for safety. Evan returned to the water the next day and listened to his radio with a calmer mind while checking his crab pots. The inlet felt different because he now understood the source, even though the memory of the voice still lingered. He looked toward the bend where the wreck rested and thought about the crew who never returned. He continued working that season with new respect for the signals that travel across water because each transmission carried a story shaped by time and tide. He did not hear his name again and believed the loop finally failed after years of corrosion. He kept the recording in a drawer at home to remind himself that strange moments sometimes come from simple causes. He knew that calm days on the inlet now carried a quiet steadiness that felt earned after weeks of searching for answers. The stories. What a delivery driver. Saw outside the last house on the route. The incident reportedly came from a route sheet pulled from an old regional dispatch office, and it referenced a final stop that never made sense. The archived note mentioned a driver who claimed someone waited outside the last house even after the street was cleared. Rylan Mercer was 32 and worked as a delivery driver for a regional shipping line that handled late evening drop-offs. He lived in a small rented place near a quiet highway spur and tried to keep his nights predictable. He clocked in around sunset and followed the route grid until everything on the manifest was scanned. He liked that rhythm and needed the extra hours after rising fuel prices drained his budget. The night that changed him came in early autumn of 2019 when a mild drizzle pushed across the county roads. His simple goal was to clear the last 4 stops before 9 so he could get home. The final house sat at the far edge of a sparsely built neighborhood where new construction had stalled after funding issues slowed development. Rylan reached the second-to-last stop without trouble and scanned the small parcel while a porch light flickered behind the occupant. He waved, returned to his truck, and checked the tablet. The final address displayed a short note that read, "Gate partially damaged. Approach with caution." He thought it sounded dramatic, but he kept moving because delays meant more paperwork. The dirt road to the final house felt different because the gravel ruts were deeper than they looked on satellite maps. His tires shook through the uneven track, and he slowed so the cargo would not shift. He remembered the drizzle turning into a steady fall that made the old fence lines appear faded. His truck headlights cut across the trees while the route timer beeped. The house came into view as a single-story structure with siding worn by years of heat. An old pickup sat beside the carport with its door cracked open like someone left in a hurry. Rylan stepped out, grabbed the padded envelope, and noticed a figure standing near the tree line. The person faced the house and barely moved. Rylan called out because it seemed natural. The figure did not answer. He felt uneasy, but walked toward the porch because the package needed a signature. He knocked on the weathered door and waited until a woman in her 40s answered with tired eyes that hinted at several sleepless nights. Her name was listed as Marrakech, and she signed without looking away from the tree line. She whispered that someone had been standing there for 3 nights. Rylan glanced back toward the trees and saw the figure slowly turn, as if reacting to the porch light. He asked Mara if she knew who it was. She said no and explained that local deputies had driven by earlier but found no footprints. She added that her dog refused to go outside after dusk. Rylan tried to reassure her, but he felt tense when the figure stepped closer. He returned to his truck and logged the delivery while watching the silhouette move with an unusual stiffness. He noted that the figure wore a long coat that flapped in the wind, yet the shape underneath did not shift. He heard a soft tapping on his side mirror and thought it was a branch until he noticed no branches reached that far. He started the engine and pulled slightly forward. Mara called out from the porch, asking him not to leave yet because she feared the figure might approach her door again. Rylan kept the truck idling and stepped out with his phone raised. The figure paused near the edge of the driveway and tilted its head as if listening. Rylan recorded a short, shaky video for possible evidence and captured the moment the figure retreated into the dark corner of the lot. He urged Mara to call the non-emergency line again. She did and mentioned his presence in the background. Dispatch reportedly confirmed previous calls from that address during the same week. Rylan waited until she hung up, then walked toward the driveway entrance to check for tracks. The drizzle had softened the soil, but he noticed 2 long impressions in the mud that did not match any standard boot pattern. He crouched to inspect the impressions and realized they looked stretched, as if the heel marks dragged unnaturally. He took photos to document it because the deputies would need something clear in case the rain erased the evidence. When he stood, he saw movement near the abandoned construction lot behind the house and raised his phone again. The figure reappeared near an unfinished foundation block. Rylan shouted, asking what they wanted, and the figure responded with a faint rattling sound that could have been fabric or gear. It stepped behind the block and vanished from sight. Rylan reached the spot within seconds, but found nothing except a plastic tape marker used by survey crews. He picked it up and noticed someone had written a date that predated the stalled project by 2 years. Mara approached carefully and said previous owners told her strange things about that construction lot. She reported hearing scraping sounds at night and seeing floodlights flicker without power issues. Rylan suggested checking the old project files because developers usually left public records. Mara said she tried, but half the records were archived manually before digital conversion. Rylan offered to look at the files later because he had experience sorting scanned documents from a part-time job years earlier. She thanked him and pointed to the tree line again. The figure stood there once more, closer than before, and seemed to watch them without any visible breathing motion. Rylan backed away and urged Mara to go inside. He waited in his truck until deputies arrived. They swept the area with flashlights and found nothing except the strange impressions in the mud. One deputy mentioned similar calls from another street where witnesses described a silent watcher near multiple houses. He said the figure always retreated beyond the last visible yard before vanishing in the dark. Rylan drove home late and reviewed his video. He noticed a faint reflection on the figure's coat that resembled a badge clip or small tool. He zoomed in and saw a blurred shape that matched old utility company tags from the early 2000 era. Employees sometimes wore heavy coats during winter maintenance, and older coats used reflective threading around the collar. The next day, he visited a small records desk at the county office. He asked about utility work in the stalled development. A clerk pulled a faded binder that listed crew rotations from 2001 to 2003. One name had several warnings about night shifts, where the worker logged extended hours without partner verification. A final note mentioned an unresolved disappearance during a routine inspection after a severe storm. Rylan compared the coat description from the old files to the figure in his video. The match seemed close, but not perfect. He requested access to old lot surveys and found a handwritten report describing a flagged hazard trench near the exact foundation block where the figure vanished. The report stated the trench was filled without proper inspection because storms destroyed monitoring equipment. He returned to Mara later that week and showed her the findings. She said deputies had returned twice and installed a temporary sensor light. She had not seen the figure since the previous night, but her dog still refused to approach the tree line. Rylan and Mara walked to the construction lot and checked the ground. The soil had settled unevenly, suggesting a collapse zone beneath the surface. Ryland believed the figure might be a residual impression, or a person reenacting old patterns from a job that ended abruptly. He shared the theory with Mara, and she nodded, relieved to hear something grounded rather than supernatural. They both agreed the coat and the strange movements could indicate someone reenacting a memory or suffering confusion while hiding from help. The county eventually fenced the lot after a safety inspector confirmed unstable ground. Ryland moved to a different route by winter and rarely saw the neighborhood again. He kept the video and photos in a private folder and updated dispatch about the gate note so new drivers would avoid the unstable area. He thought about the figure sometimes when rain hit the windshield during his late runs. The memory stayed sharp because the silence in that yard felt heavier than the weather. He never claimed to know the full truth, but he trusted the possibility of a confused worker returning to a familiar site. He understood that some routes go beyond simple deliveries. He believed the last house had carried a story that lingered longer than any scanned package. The stories. What a night janitor found behind the vending machine. Roughly 10 years ago, a late shift incident at a small distribution center led to a report that never reached public records. The file described something a night janitor found behind a vending machine after a quiet shift turned strange. Ryland Cho worked nights at a regional packing warehouse on the edge of a mid-sized town. He was 37 and had been there almost 7 years. He liked the silence after midnight and usually finished his route with music in his earbuds. On this particular night, in late spring of 2014, he wanted to clock out early and get home before a storm hit the valley. He started in the loading bay with a simple goal for the night. Finish his checklist, empty the bins, and mop the narrow hallway near the break room before the wind picked up outside. The building felt colder than usual, and the air system made a steady hum that covered most small sounds. The incident began around 1:30 in the morning when Ryland passed the break room and saw the vending machine screen flick on by itself. The machine had been glitchy before, so he did not think much of it until he noticed the light did not show the usual bright menu. Instead, it looked dim with a strange gray shimmer moving across the glass. A soft tapping sound came from behind the machine. Ryland stepped closer and asked out loud if someone was stuck. He expected no reply. The tapping repeated 2 times with steady rhythm. He backed up a little and checked the doorway leading to the maintenance hall. No one else should have been there since the last forklift crew left hours earlier. He went to find the shift supervisor but realized he was alone for the next hour since the supervisor had gone to the far lot to handle a truck issue. Ryland returned to the break room and watched the machine again. The shimmer on the screen grew lighter, then faded. He unplugged the power cord to reset it, and the tapping stopped. When he pushed the machine slightly, he felt something resist from behind. The machine sat tight against the wall with no gap. He moved it a few inches and saw a narrow, dark space behind the right side panel. Something metallic glinted inside the space. Ryland grabbed his small work light from the janitor cart and angled the beam toward the opening. A metal box covered with dust sat wedged between the drywall and the machine frame. The box looked old. The lid had a faded sticker with part of a name scratched off. He reached in and pulled it free. Inside were 3 items: a small bound notebook, a thin plastic badge with a photo rubbed almost blank, and an audio recorder the size of a deck of cards. The notebook smelled musty. The first page held uneven handwriting, saying property of Hale Dorn, who worked maintenance from 2003 to 2008 based on a short training archive. Ryland later checked. Ryland remembered hearing from older staff that Hale left suddenly after a safety investigation. Nothing official remained in the shared files. Most said he moved away. A few said he had filed complaints about strange vibrations near the break room wall. Ryland opened the notebook carefully. The first entry from early 2006 described recurring knocking sounds near the vending machine as well as faint static pulses in the wall during night shifts. Hale wrote that he made several unofficial recordings, but none stayed consistent when reviewed later. The next entries grew more detailed. Hale noted timestamps, short sketches of sound waves, and small maps of the hallway layout. One entry from late 2006 described a night when the machine screen flickered with a gray wash, similar to what Ryland had seen hours earlier. Hale wrote that the tapping seemed to follow his movements around the room. Ryland turned to the last written page, dated mid-2007. It read, "I need to get someone to check the wiring before this gets worse." The lines after that looked rushed. Hale wrote that he found a small access hole behind the machine with a narrow duct running into the maintenance room. He believed air pressure changes inside the duct caused some of the sounds. The next note stated, "I still hear something moving in there, although the duct should be empty." Ryland set the notebook down and inspected the audio recorder. It contained a small tape with a handwritten label that read Night Shift Sample 2. He slipped it into his pocket with the plan to listen later under better light. He then checked the badge. The image showed Hale with short hair and tired eyes. The back listed his role as maintenance support. Ryland pushed the machine farther from the wall to look for the duct mentioned in the notes. A narrow circular opening near the baseboard revealed an old service channel that ran behind several rooms. It had not been used in years based on the dust and cobwebs. The channel connected to the maintenance room and likely carried air back when the building used a different system. He crouched closer and felt a cool draft from deep inside the channel. The draft moved in a steady pulse instead of a constant stream. When he leaned nearer, he heard a faint scrape followed by two soft taps. He jumped back and called out if anyone was inside. No reply followed. Ryland stood still and waited for another sound. 3 minutes passed quietly. He reached into the opening with the work light and shined the beam across the first few feet. Dust floated in the narrow space and nothing moved. The scrape sound did not repeat. He repositioned the vending machine and photographed the channel opening so he could show the supervisor. He then finished his route feeling uneasy. When his shift ended at 3, he took the notebook and recorder home. Later that afternoon, he listened to the tape. It began with low background hum, likely from the old air system. 30 seconds in, a rhythmic tapping started. It matched the pattern Ryland heard earlier. The tapping repeated 4 times, then stopped. Hale's voice spoke quietly, saying, "I know the duct is empty, yet it keeps making that pattern." The tape ended with a short static burst. Ryland cross-checked the tape with archived maintenance logs from 2006 available through an internal server. He found a note about air pressure complaints near the break room, but no follow-up reports. The log mentioned Hale's concern about a possible leak inside the service channel and recommended an inspection that never occurred. Ryland met with the supervisor the next night and showed the findings. The supervisor listened to part of the tape and agreed that the sound pattern matched what past crews mentioned during older shifts. He filed a report to the facilities manager, who arranged a full inspection later that week. The inspection team removed the vending machine and opened the service channel. They found a partially detached metal flap deep inside that moved when the air system cycled. The flap created repeated taps during pressure changes, which explained the pattern recorded by Hale. Inspectors also found old tools left behind by a previous contractor, which caused the scrape Ryland heard. The team sealed the channel, repaired the flap, and recommended replacing the vending machine wiring due to aging components that caused the strange screen flicker reported by both Hale and Ryland. 2 weeks later, the warehouse returned to normal. The tapping never came back. The recording was archived inside a general maintenance file, and the notebook was stored with other historical documents kept for internal reference. Ryland kept thinking about how one small discovery behind a vending machine connected him to someone who tried to document the same odd sounds years earlier. He believed Hale had tried to solve a problem that no one else seemed to notice until the notes surfaced again. The story lives quietly inside a handful of reports, and one old tape that proves how simple, overlooked issues can create experiences that feel much stranger than they are, especially during long nights when empty hallways amplify every sound. Corin prepared to leave, and he secured the logbook under his arm because he planned to hand it over to the harbor office. As he reached the ground floor, he heard a deep thud from above, like something heavy striking the metal railing. He looked up the stairwell and saw dust drifting through the pale air, and he called out in a steady voice, asking if anyone needed help. No reply came, and he hurried outside because the building felt wrong. The fog had thickened into a wall that blocked the path back to town, and he saw a faint glow near the rocks as though the skiff lights flickered through the mist. He considered walking toward the beach, and he radioed the harbor office with a brief report of strange activity near the tower. Dispatch logs indicate that Corin's transmission cut off mid-sentence, and the signal ended with a burst of static. A search team followed the path an hour later, and they found his tool pack near the lighthouse door, but not his radio or the logbook. Witness statements described drifting voices on the water that night, and one crew member claimed he saw a dim lantern moving inside the tower. The unsigned log discovered months later matched the fragments found in Corin's notes, and investigators believed the entries were written over several days. They concluded that the skiff likely struck a submerged ledge, and they suspected Corin attempted to reach survivors through the dense fog. No further entries appeared after the final line mentioning the figure on the gallery. The lighthouse remains closed today, and the tower stands quiet during most storms. Local crews say the watchroom light sometimes flickers during heavy fog, and they assume it is faulty wiring from years of neglect. The final log stays in a small archive where the pages still show faint stains from salt air and old sea fog, and the case sits unsolved with quiet respect for the missing caretaker. The stories? A camper's forgotten tape exposed the real reason they closed the park. The old park had been shut for years after a string of unexplained incidents that locals still mentioned in quiet tones. The only solid clue ever discussed came from a small camcorder tape found inside a forgotten overnight pack near the North Trail. The story followed a 26-year-old school technician named Lyle Rooker, who visited the park in early autumn of 2019. He worked long weeks in a crowded lab and wanted one quiet weekend before the winter rush returned. He drove out early on a Friday, hoping to film some wildlife and maybe catch a quiet sunrise near the ridge. Lyle picked a simple loop near a small lake and planned to reach a clearing before dark so he could set up his camp. He checked the weather, loaded his pack, then started the trail with a relaxed pace that matched the quiet feel of the woods. The place had been thinning in visitors for years, and he enjoyed the stillness while he walked toward the lake. The incident started when he noticed a narrow side path marked only by faded blue tape tied around a leaning pine. He looked at his printed map and saw no hint of that path, even though it seemed recently used by something heavy. The ground showed deep impressions and a few dragged lines that he could not match with normal hiker traffic. Lyle moved closer to inspect the impressions, and he recorded a brief clip while he knelt near the dirt with the camcorder. Witness statements later noted that his voice sounded uneasy when he said he might return later to check the full length of the side path. He continued toward the lake, though he kept glancing back with a nervous expression that showed in later recovered frames. When he reached the clearing, he met a retired ranger named Colton Reeves, who often walked the trail for exercise. Colton warned him about stray dogs reported near the ridge and advised him to stay on the main path if he heard anything heavy moving. Lyle agreed, though he mentioned the strange impressions near the pine. Colton seemed unsettled by that detail and said he had not seen blue tape in that area before. That short exchange later became an important piece of the investigation because Colton described Lyle as alert and fully oriented. Dispatch logs showed that the ranger left the clearing around the same time Lyle began setting up his small tent beside the lake. The sun was dropping behind the ridge, and he recorded a simple note saying he would return home early Sunday. The complication began when distant knocks echoed across the water after sunset. The tape captured 3 sharp hits, followed by a slow dragging sound that rolled through the trees. Lyle whispered a short question, asking if someone was swinging tools, but no voice answered before the sound faded. He stepped outside with the camcorder, and the footage trembled slightly while he walked toward the shoreline. That part of the tape showed ripples moving across the lake, though the surface looked calm seconds earlier. A dim shape crossed from right to left near the far bank, but the frame blurred before any exact detail formed. Investigators later judged the shape to be human-sized, though they could not confirm height or posture. Lyle backed away, and he ended the clip with a quick excuse that he needed more light. Evidence gathered from his tent indicated he tried to sleep but stayed awake most of the night. His pack remained open, and he had placed the camcorder near the entrance so he could reach it quickly. Around 2 in the morning, a second set of knocks started. The tape recorded them with clearer tone, and they sounded closer to the clearing than before. Lyle stepped out and aimed the camcorder toward the trees near the side path. The audio picked up cracking undergrowth along with short breaths that suggested he was frightened, yet still curious enough to film. Then a faint voice appeared near the edge of the microphone range. The voice asked if anyone had seen the dog from the ridge and repeated the question twice. Investigators matched the voice to a missing hiker reported 3 seasons earlier, according to archived calls. That hiker had vanished during a late storm near the North Trail, and his final message referenced a stray dog that followed him across the ridge. The match was considered probable, though never confirmed, because the audio was worn with age. Lyle walked a few steps toward the sound, though he kept enough distance for a quick retreat. The tape showed a tall figure standing between 2 pines with an odd tilt at the shoulders. The figure swayed slowly, as if injured, and the lower right side appeared fixed in a stiff angle. Lyle asked if the person needed help. The voice did not answer, and the figure moved further into the trees without showing its face. The investigation deepened when rangers found Lyle's camp untouched the following afternoon, with his tent still upright and his food sealed. His phone lay inside the tent with 2 attempted calls made around 3 that morning. The calls never connected due to weak signal. The camcorder was found near the base of the leaning pine where the faint blue tape had been tied. Search teams followed the side path and found more deep impressions along with a torn jacket fragment that matched the missing hiker's clothing from 3 seasons earlier. The fragment was caught on a low branch roughly 20 yards from where Lyle recorded the swaying figure. Soil samples indicated repeated movement through that area, though not enough to identify specific tracks. The twist emerged when investigators compared Lyle's final clip with an older wildlife survey recorded 6 years earlier. Both clips captured the same faint voice asking about the dog near the ridge. The survey team noted the voice, but assumed it came from campers beyond the tree line. The match suggested a pattern of someone or something calling from the same area across multiple years. The official report stated that the park remained unsafe due to unstable terrain near the North Trail and ongoing search efforts tied to older missing persons cases. Unofficially, several rangers believed the repeated voice signaled a person who wandered off the main path and survived through unknown means. They felt the figure avoided help and followed hikers who entered the side path after dark. Lyle was never found despite extensive searches that covered every marked route and several unmarked stretches. His camcorder tape became the final recorded clue, showing his calm approach that shifted to rising fear as the figure moved away. The park closed soon after officials reviewed the tapes and compared them with archived survey audio. The case left a quiet note in local reports, stating that people sometimes leave trails for reasons no one fully understands. The forgotten tape remained the clearest glimpse into those final hours, and it shaped the quiet acceptance that the park would not reopen in the near future. The closing line on the internal report stated that some paths stay hidden for good reasons, and not every question finds a safe answer. The stories. Never take the shortcut behind the closed factory. The old shortcut behind the closed factory had a reputation that reportedly dated back to the early 2000s. Local reports described strange audio picked up by nearby delivery cameras during quiet nights when almost no one walked there. A worker named Lyron Strayed, who was 34 and handled maintenance jobs across small industrial sites, first heard those claims during a routine shift. He did not care much because his focus that day was finishing a late repair, then getting home before midnight. His route usually stayed along the main road, which felt safer and better lit. That changed when a dispatcher called near the end of his shift and asked for a quick check on a generator that kept tripping alarms. The generator sat near the old factory's fence line, which meant he had to park close to the edge of the blocked shortcut. He grabbed his tool bag and walked toward the unit while thinking about the shortcut stories he had ignored for years. The generator itself looked fine, though the alarm reset kept glitching in a way that suggested a loose internal relay. Lyron unscrewed the panel and ran a simple line test, which showed steady current without major issues. He decided the alarm might be reacting to stray interference from another unit placed years earlier near the empty factory. He stepped around the corner to inspect the older unit and noticed something unusual on the dirt path behind the fence. Fresh tire marks cut through the narrow corridor that was supposed to be locked and unused. He checked the fence and found the chain wrapped but not fully secured, like someone had looped it quickly without snapping the lock. Lyron returned to his truck for a small flashlight and snapped 2 photos of the fence for his report. He wanted to note it in case building management had missed scheduled security checks. When he stepped back toward the generator, his radio crackled with a faint distorted signal that did not match the dispatch channel he normally heard. He held the radio higher and listened as the interference grew stronger. A voice whispered a short phrase that sounded like an address fragment, though the last part cut out sharply. He checked his phone to compare signal strength, yet noticed a timestamp glitch on his call log that he had never seen before. He documented that odd timestamp with another photo, then continued to follow the tire tracks just far enough to understand their direction. They ran straight toward a collapsed loading ramp behind the factory that had not been accessed since a structural inspection during 1999. The ground around the ramp looked disturbed, like heavy weight had pressed into softened soil. He decided to notify dispatch from his truck, but his radio remained unstable even after he switched frequencies twice. A high-pitched tone hit suddenly, forcing him to hold the device farther from his ear. When the tone stopped, The radio returned to silence, and his screen lit with a brief recorded notification that did not belong to his model. Lyron scrolled through the message and found a short, archived clip that showed poor quality video from an unknown camera. The clip displayed the same loading ramp he had just examined. A figure moved across the screen, but disappeared mid-frame like the feed had dropped instantly. He drove closer to the edge of the shortcut and shut off his headlights to see the area better. The last street lamp flickered, producing uneven light over the ramp and fence. He kept his phone ready for an emergency call. He also reviewed his earlier photos because he wanted a clearer sense of the path shape before stepping near it again. Details he overlooked became clearer with a second look. The tire tracks overlapped an older set of boot prints that moved in the opposite direction toward the outer road. Those prints looked narrow and deep, like someone had walked quickly while carrying a heavy load. He checked the soil near his boots and found similar compression marks that matched the archived clip patterns almost exactly. He took more pictures and followed the tracks until he reached a corroded service door near the ramp. The door sat slightly open, though crews had sealed it with metal brackets during 2006. He pushed gently and felt resistance from warped hinges rather than any locking mechanism. Inside, the air smelled stale, and dust covered most surfaces. His light caught the outline of a forklift abandoned long ago, though the tire dust pattern suggested recent movement that did not match the machine's dead battery state. He lifted the engine cover briefly and saw untouched corrosion that proved the forklift had not operated recently, which made the tracks outside even stranger. Near the back wall, he found a stack of handwritten notes taped to a cabinet. The pages carried dates from the late 2000s and documented repeated complaints about unauthorized after-hours activity. One note mentioned an unidentified van entering through the same corridor that created the tire marks he saw. Another described auditory anomalies inside the building, captured by a security mic later removed during an equipment reduction. He copied the notes by taking photos and moved to the other end of the room where a damaged camera hung loose. The camera's data card remained inside, though the casing had cracked. He removed the card carefully and placed it inside an evidence pouch he kept for documenting property damage. The pouch kept dust-off sensitive parts, which might help tech staff recover something useful. When he stepped outside again, he noticed the street lamp flickering faster. A shadow crossed the ramp area, though no one appeared nearby. He raised his flashlight and scanned slowly until the beam caught a piece of torn reflective tape stuck to the fence. The tape matched a style used by highway crews in the early 2000s and had similar aging patterns to tape visible in the archived clip. He returned to his truck to call dispatch again and finally reached a stable connection. The dispatcher listened, then pulled up two old maintenance logs that referenced unusual trespassing during night shifts between 2003 and 2008. Those logs mentioned a possible smuggling route using the service door before the factory closed. The route was believed sealed after the inspection in 2006, but no follow-up confirmation existed. Lyron asked the dispatcher to check one more detail, specifically whether any recent patrol cars had reported activity near the shortcut. She checked and found a brief report from earlier that evening. A driver claimed he saw a van enter the far side of the blocked road, though no vehicle appeared on traffic cams afterward. He finished his call and walked back toward the generator to close his initial work order. The radio interference returned, but softer, almost like the earlier voice had weakened. He waited to see if anything else came through. Only a faint click repeated twice, matching the distortion pattern from the archived clip. Before leaving, he photographed the loading ramp again, along with the surrounding soil. When he reviewed the new images, he saw a fresh indentation near the forklift room entrance, as if someone or something had stepped there after he exited. The shape looked too narrow for a normal boot, but aligned perfectly with the print glimpse seen in the archived clip. He left the site carefully and locked the outer gate before sending all photos and the data card to the tech department. He then wrote a detailed report describing each anomaly exactly as he observed it. His findings matched older complaints closely, creating a pattern that suggested someone had been using the closed corridor long after the factory shut down. The next morning, the tech team confirmed the data card contained partial footage from 2 nights earlier that showed the same shadow crossing the loading ramp. They also discovered faint audio that matched the strange voice Lyron heard through his radio. It repeated the same clipped address fragment that had confused him near the generator. Investigators later checked that fragment and found it corresponded to an unregistered storage lot once connected to the factory by a freight contract during the late 1990s. The lot had changed ownership several times without clear documentation, which explained why no record connected it to the shortcut corridor anymore. Lyron stayed involved through follow-up calls for several weeks. His report became part of a larger inquiry into abandoned freight routes that still carried untracked activity. The case remained unofficial because none of the evidence pointed to a clear suspect or purpose. It only showed movement that had restarted for unknown reasons. He sometimes drove past the site after work and noticed the city had installed better locks and stronger lights. The shortcut no longer flickered with the eerie randomness that greeted him that night. He never again heard the distorted voice or saw odd timestamps on his radio displays. The experience left him cautious about places that looked abandoned but still carried signs of movement. He understood how easily someone could miss tiny clues unless the light hit them at the right angle. Every tire, track, shadow, and flicker had pointed to something real that operated quietly in the gaps between forgotten structures. He still thinks about the warning he heard from older workers who told him to avoid that corridor. Their stories felt exaggerated back then, yet the evidence he gathered proved there was always something strange behind the closed factory.